Well, greetings to you from Singapore. My name is Jared Jung, and I am pleased to have an opportunity to share with you my research on Pastor Wang Yi's public theology in honor of Pastor Wang Yi's birthday. While I am grateful for Pastor Wang Yi's witness to the church in China of Christ's kingship over all nations and all authorities, I do also recognize that this witness has cost him greatly as he continues to await his release in prison, separated from his wife and his son, his parents, and the brothers and sisters at Early Rain. I continue to remember him in my prayers and pray for his faith to remain strong, for the Lord to sustain his health, and for a timely release. This morning, I was reading Acts 9, and it struck me that when Christ appears to Paul on the road to Damascus, he asked him this question: "Why are you persecuting me?" And I thought to myself, how assuring it is that we serve a Savior that so identifies himself with his people that to persecute one of his people is the same as persecuting him. And so, as Wang Yi shares in Christ's sufferings, we continue to pray that it will serve to build up his church in China and throughout the world. My research in Pastor Wang Yi centered on his public theology. In particular, I find that Pastor Wang Yi's public theology has many similarities to the founders of Neo-Calvinism and the Neo-Calvinist movement, the Dutch theologians Abraham Kuyper and Herman Bavinck. And so for my doctoral dissertation, I studied Pastor Wang Yi's works in comparison to the works of Kuyper and Bavinck in order to see how they were similar and how they were different. What resulted from that was a dissertation that I titled Costly Kuyperianism: Neo-Calvinist Public Theology in a Context of Persecution, with a focus on Pastor Wang Yi. My interest in this research began actually with a quote from D.A. Carson. In his work, Christ and Culture Revisited, Carson, at the very beginning, he has a footnote. It's not even a comment that's important to the work as a whole, but he just has a footnote. And in the footnote, he comments that if Abraham Kuyper had grown up under the conditions of the killing fields of Cambodia, one suspects his view of the relationship between Christianity and culture would have been significantly modified. Essentially, what Carson is suggesting is that, look, Kuyper, he did his work in the Netherlands in the late 19th century, the early 20th century. In this place and time, Christianity was widely accepted. It was part of the culture. And it was very easy to come up with concepts like common grace, concepts like a church as institution and organism, these kinds of concepts that are known in Neo-Calvinism. And this thought of Kuyper and then Kuyper's contemporary Herman Bavinck. These are very optimistic comments about the church's role and its ability to engage society, to transform society. However, what Carson is suggesting is that, however, if Kuyper was in a context of persecution, like in Carson's, what he says is in a situation like, say, in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, what he wrote would have been quite different. And perhaps Kuyper wouldn't have been so optimistic. Maybe there would be no Neo-Calvinism as we know it today. And in essence, what Carson, I think, is suggesting is that perhaps Neo-Calvinism, it cannot exist in context of persecution. And I found this very interesting. This is very interesting to me because as someone who had lived and worked in China, who knew about the church in China, I recognized that much of Wang Yi's public theology actually bore similarities to the thought of Kuyper and Bavinck. And I also recognized that Wang Yi was a significant target for persecution, and that many in his church also were willing to suffer persecution for the sake of this understanding that a church is to have a public presence in society, even in society in communist China, and they need to have this presence apart from joining the Three Self Church. So this led me to research Wang Yi's work in order to answer Carson's statement. How does persecution impact Kuyperian public theology? What I want to do today is summarize my research for you in order to present to you Pastor Wang Yi's costly Kuyperianism. And the way that I'm going to do this is to present to you 4 key similarities between Kuyper and Bavinck and Pastor Wang Yi in their public theology. And then also, I'm sorry, not 4, 5 key similarities. My apologies. 5 key similarities between Kuyper and Bavinck and Wang Yi, and then 5 important ways that I do believe that Wang Yi modifies Kuyper and Bavinck's thought to make neo-Calvinist public theology an option in situations of persecution. Now, Kuyper and Bavinck's work remains very important to the Western world, not only in the Netherlands now, but also in places like the U.S. Neo-Calvinist public theology has become much more popular. And I was also encouraged to find out that Wang Yi draws help from Kuyper, from Bavinck, but from other more contemporary neo-Calvinist sources like the late pastor theologian Timothy Keller. And so it didn't surprise me to find these similarities. So there are 5 similarities that I want to look at between Kuyper and Bavinck's neo-Calvinist public theology and the neo-Calvinist public theology of Pastor Wang Yi. And those are in the areas of the cultural mandate. The cultural mandate, of course, being found in the opening chapters of the Bible in Genesis 1 and 2, and understanding the cultural mandate as God's mission given to humanity that is to be fulfilled by humanity. And even before the fall, seeing this mission as something that has an eschatological bend to it. In essence, that the final creation, the consummated creation that we find at the end of the Bible in the book of Revelation is a fulfillment of what God began in seed form in Genesis 1 and 2, when he told Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth and subdue it, and to have dominion, to steward the rest of creation. And then when we go into Genesis 2, the way God tells Adam to go about doing that, he tells them to go about doing that by cultivating, by growing, by developing, by cultivating the Garden of Eden and spreading that and having more image bearers of God going throughout the world, so that in the end, the knowledge of the Lord that's so apparent in the Garden of Eden would fill the earth as the waters cover the seas. And this involves things like cultural development. This involves things like technological development and things like that, but it involves doing it according to God's wills and according to God's will and according to God's ways. And so Wang Yi shared in this. Wang Yi also is a believer in the cultural mandate. He does not reject the cultural mandate, or that the cultural mandate is still valid for the church, like we see some doing in, say, a two kingdoms theology. Wang Yi believes the cultural mandate is still valid for the church today. As a pastor, he speaks to the importance of the church's participation in the work of renewing the world. And so with Kuyper and Bavinck, Wang Yi believes that the church should participate in the cultural mandate to seek to redeem, to seek to restore the society in which it exists. And so this is different, again, from two kingdom public theology that denies the necessity of the cultural mandate for the church today. It's very different, certainly from a separation and Anabaptist style separatism in that form of public theology that's common. You find common among many traditional house churches in China. Wang Yi's theology holds that Christians are to redeem fallen cultural activity, and this aligns him with neo-Calvinism. This is a clear area where he finds similarities with Kuyper and Bavinck. The second area of similarity is in this idea of common grace. Now, if you are here, and I suspect many of you are here, you come from Reformed churches, you might think common grace is something that's just everybody believes in, but that's not the case. Actually, the doctrine of common grace really, it kind of finds its root in the theology of Calvin. But at the same time, was developed most fully by Abraham Kuyper, and then also was developed by Herman Bavinck. And so, like Kuyper, Wang Yi, he believes that God preserves the world through his common grace. And God does this by allowing culture to develop and by limiting the power of sin in the world. So the Calvinist idea of total depravity does not mean that we are as depraved as we possibly could be. No, actually, God limits the power of sin. Otherwise, because of our sin, we would absolutely destroy ourselves and destroy the whole of creation. And so God limits this by common grace. Like Kuyper and Bavinck, Wang Yi actually roots common grace in the Noahic covenant. This is something that Kuyper distinctly does, and Bavinck follows him in this, in finding common grace beginning in God's covenant with creation that happened after the flood with Noah. Now, I'm not going to go into the biblical theological details and arguments concerning that, but here I just want to note that Wang Yi, he agrees with this. And in church history, he sees common grace. Wang Yi sees common grace as a distinctly reformed doctrine that stems from Calvin's appreciation for creation. So there's much that Wang Yi shares with Kuyper and Bavinck in his understanding of common grace. The third area that I found similarities between Kuyper and Bavinck and Wang Yi is the way that both understand the church as both an institute and an organism. And this was something that was developed in particular by Abraham Kuyper. Wang Yi believes that the church as an institute fuels the organic church and its activities and missions in day-to-day life. Now, the church's institute essentially refers to the church gathered. This is the church on Sunday morning. This is the church and its functions and the sacraments and the preached word. This is the church blessing its members. And the way that Kuyper describes the institutional church is what we would call today the church gathered. Now, the organic church, on the other hand, is what we would call the church scattered. This is the church, let's say, Monday to Saturday. This is the church as its members go out in every sphere of society, and they're working in the work world, and they're with their families, and they're in different institutions and things like that. This is kind of the organic church, what Kuyper and Bavinck would call the organic church. Now, ultimately, for Kuyper and Bavinck, what they see is that the institutional church is designed to fuel the organic church. Kuyper describes it as kind of a tent. If the organic church is at war, that's where the mission of the church is happening out in the world. What happens is we gather on Sundays to fuel ourselves for that, to resupply ourselves, to receive the means of grace so we can go out. And Wang Yi, he understands that. He has an agreement with that the church as an institute fuels the organic church and its activities, its missions, and day-to-day life. The institutional church and its activities of mercy, of preaching, of teaching, and the sacrament administers to its members, who then will take the church into the world organically. Wang Yi makes a distinct effort in his preaching to connect the institutional church, which he values very highly, to his people as the organic church, and to ensure that their faith connects to their lives missionally. I think one of the key examples of this I found in Wang Yi's sermons is actually in a service that Early Rain held, in which Wang Yi, he preached about the organic church, and he preached how people are to go out into the world and to transform society, and no matter where they are called as Christians. And he actually invites people that are in the professional world, business people, lawyers, attorneys, anyone, mothers, anyone in the congregation, to come forward, to have the elders actually pray over them in a commissioning to send them out into the world as ministers of the gospel in the world, not only honoring the priesthood of all believers, but also recognizing this connection between the institute and the organism of the church. The fourth area where I found similarities, particularly here in between Herman Bavinck and Wang Yi, is this idea of the Catholicity of Christianity in the church. Now, Wang Yi doesn't, Herman Bavinck, he actually has an article called The Catholicity of Christianity in the Church. I think it's one of his best works. The article has been translated into English. But here, Bavinck explains the church ultimately is it's Catholic, Catholic in the sense of being universal, the universal church, Catholic in the sense of what we proclaim in the Apostles' Creed, that we believe in the Holy Catholic Church, not Roman Catholic, but actually a Catholicity in the sense of the universality of the church. But what Bavinck does is he goes on, he says, not only that the church is Catholic in that it can be found anywhere in the world, that it's united as one throughout the world, but Bavinck goes on to say, because the church is Catholic and it proclaims Christ, what that means is that Christianity as a religion is actually Catholic in the sense that it's a universal religion for the whole world. In other words, Christianity is not just something that's done on Sunday mornings, and it's not just something that's done in private for the church to do and just leave the rest of the world, but actually Christianity is Catholic over the world, and that it has something to say to the world. And for Wang Yi, although he doesn't have an explicit teaching of the Catholicity of Christianity, the Catholicity of the church in the way that Bavinck does, that concept is latent in his understanding of the church's position in the world. Wang Yi views Christianity not only as one option for religious belief among many others, but actually Christianity for Wang Yi, as for Bavinck, is an exclusive reality to which everyone in the world is bound, whether or not they ascribe to that reality. And what this means for the church is that the Catholicity of Christianity causes the church to transcend cultural and linguistic and social boundaries and actually to create an alternate kingdom to the kingdoms of the world. So the church represents a Catholic reality to the outside world in its words and its deeds. And so the church's Catholicity in this sense is actually rooted in the Catholicity of Christianity. And so Wang Yi agrees with Bavinck. He follows Bavinck in that. And then finally, the fifth area of commonality between Kuyper and Bavinck and Wang Yi, and what I think is probably, well, this is specifically actually for Abraham Kuyper, and the strongest connection that I found between Kuyper's thought and Wang Yi's thought was that of sphere sovereignty, which may be the thing that Kuyper is known the best for. Wang Yi is also a proponent of sphere sovereignty. Like Kuyper, Wang Yi holds that God is sovereign over all of creation and thus has given every sphere of creation, he's assigned each sphere its purpose and its duties to fulfill. Along with that, like Kuyper, Wang Yi holds that one sphere ought not encroach upon another sphere, right? And this especially comes out with Kuyper and with Wang Yi in the area of the sphere of the state. They both view the state as one sphere among many in society, not a greater sphere in any way. But it's a sphere in particular that runs the risk of encroaching on other spheres. That includes the sphere of the church, the institutional church. The state can step foot wrongly in the way of the institutional church. And Wang Yi is highly critical of a state that encroaches upon the free worship and God-given responsibilities of the institutional church. And so it's for this reason that most of Wang Yi's work regarding sphere sovereignty actually surrounds the relationship between church and state. The separation of church and state is at the forefront of Wang Yi's explanations of the distinctiveness of Chinese house churches, why the house churches are distinct from the three self-churches. This is what stands behind Wang Yi's frequent critiques of the three self-church and Wang Yi's public protests. And his protest of government pressure and the way he's willing to do this in his writings, the way he's willing to preach against this kind of pressure on the church from the pulpit as well. All of that, these things that Wang Yi is well known for, I found a lot of that is actually rooted in his understanding of sphere sovereignty. So those are 5 areas: the cultural mandate, common grace, Catholicity of Christianity, sphere sovereignty, and the church's institute and organism. Sorry, I got those out of order there because I forgot the church's institute and organism. So that's 5 areas where I find similarities between Kuyper and Bavinck and Wang Yi. However, keep in mind, what I was wanting to do with my research was to answer the question, but how does persecution impact neo-Calvinist public theology? And in order to do that, if there's going to be any impact whatsoever, it was not enough just to say, well, Wang Yi agrees with Kuyper and Bavinck, but actually we needed to go a step further and say, does Wang Yi modify Kuyper and Bavinck and modify these 5 areas of agreement in any way? And I found that there was a significant modification, and that this significant modification it presented what I call a costly Kuyperianism. And I actually think it's an improvement on the work that Kuyper and Bavinck have done, especially when you consider that not just in China today, but throughout the world, Christianity remains the most persecuted religion in the world today, and that it's increasing. Everywhere in the world, we're finding that persecution is increasing. In some places, this is minor. In some places like China, it's significant. In some places like India, with the rise of Hindu nationalism and the BJP under Modi, what we find there is that the church is suffering greater and greater and greater pressure and persecution in India today. Even in areas as far as Manipur. Manipur has a significant Christian population, namely because it's mostly tribal. I have many of my own students come from that area, and they report a significant rise in Hindu nationalism in Manipur and places like that in India. It's in Asia. It's coming to the rise in Africa. Of course, we know about places like the Middle East, like North Africa, like Central Asia. We know places like this where Christianity, where the persecution of Christianity has been on the rise. And so Wang Yi's modifications actually help for the global church, I think, to be able to grasp neo-Calvinist public theology. So along with those 5 areas of continuity, I'm going to revisit all 5 of those areas and show you how those 5 areas are different in some ways, how Wang Yi modifies those 5 areas and develops them from what Kuyper and Bavinck did. So first, I'm going to start with the cultural mandate. And what Wang Yi has is what I call a cruciform cultural mandate. A cruciform cultural mandate. You see, in Kuyper and Bavinck's time, Christianity still determined a lot of the culture. It formed a lot of the culture of Western culture in the Netherlands, and also in other places where we've seen neo-Calvinism take root, like in the US. That's not the case in China, as all of you know. In China, Christianity is not, on the whole, culturally formative. China has a long cultural history that precedes and predates the entry of Christianity into China. And even beyond that, the impact of communism, the impact of the Cultural Revolution and things like that have had an extreme impact on China's culture. And a lot of what we've seen with technological development, with economic development, with a rise in prosperity in China and things like this, this has also actually served in many ways to keep Christianity from being a formative part of Chinese culture. So that's very different between Wang Yi and Kuyper and Bavinck. Furthermore, churches in China exist under pressure and persecution because of the Chinese state, the government, that does not allow for direction, that doesn't allow for things like plurality, a plurality of associations where you can have organizations and spheres of society that remain independent from the state, and even a desire for having a different king than the king of the state. That plurality is not allowed in China. And because of that, the government of China views the church as an ideological competitor in such a way that just wasn't the case with Kuyper and Bavinck. So often this kind of marginalization and this persecution, they go hand in hand, and that's certainly the case in China. However, Wang Yi still believes that the cultural mandate given to Adam and Eve is determinative of the redemptive work of the church, right? So the church still has a responsibility, even in a situation like China, even in persecution, to look at the cultural mandate and to see that the church still has this responsibility to do this work of cultural transformation, even if it's temporary. Now, this was one of Kuyper's specialties. work on common grace is 3 volumes, 3 very thick volumes of work on the doctrine of common grace that went over a course of years. It was actually a summary of addresses of newspaper articles that Kuyper wrote when Kuyper was editing a newspaper. He wrote these newspaper articles, and this course went over years of time, and he wrote those all in his 3 volumes of Common Grace. So Common Grace is very important to Abraham Kuyper's public theology. Kuyper's Common Grace is very optimistic. What it says is actually, it suggests that the church should be involved in things like transforming society, but also that the church can do things like transform society because of common grace. However, in a culture in which the church is marginalized, in which cultural and societal influence from any sphere, any area of society outside of the state is actually viewed by the state as a threat, like China. That's the case of China today. In a culture like this, Christian activities to redeem culture and society, they're going to be met with strong resistance. Kuyper doesn't recognize this because he's not in this situation, but Wang Yi does recognize this. Because of this, Wang Yi's call for cultural transformation takes a distinctly cruciform shape. So Wang Yi believes that rather than avoid the cultural mandate, in other words, persecution doesn't cause the church to run away from the cultural mandate. The church actually needs to still engage, but to suffer accordingly for ministering to the culture. Again, this is very different than Kuyper and Bavinck. This is different from much of Western Kuyperianism. In contexts where the church is relatively moored to Christian values and Christian presuppositions, cultural mandate work typically doesn't take a cruciform shape. As a matter of fact, as we found among many liberal denominations in the West, actually, when you step away from doing the work of evangelism and discipleship, and you actually you're just going to do the work of cultural transformation in the sense of building hospitals and things like that, actually, the culture kind of welcomes that. However, in China, that's not the case. No matter how well-intentioned the church is in all of its efforts, of cultural transformation, it's often going to be met with opposition. A lot of this is because the church's culture is distinctly different than the culture of China. And the biblical worldview is distinctly different from that worldview in very, very blatant and obvious ways that often get blurred in the Western world. But what Wang Yi says is that Christ purchased redemption with crucifixion. And if that redemption involves all of life, including culture and society, if that's what the redemption involves, it's not just redeeming souls, but it's redeeming everything in the world. And at the end picture, the eschatological picture is one of a redeemed creation, not just attached redeemed souls, but actually redeemed bodies and individuals, a redeemed church, and then a whole redeemed creation. If that is what Christ's crucifixion purchases, then the church is going to have to walk in the way of its Redeemer, which is a way of suffering. This includes cultural mandate ministries. The cultural mandate is not excluded from the church's mission under persecution. So where Kuyper develops this idea of the cultural mandate, Kuyper and Bavinck, Wang Yi, he also takes this and develops it, and it becomes a cruciform cultural mandate. Okay, that was the cultural mandate. Number 2, common grace. Again, Kuyper is very, very, I'm trying to think of how to say it. Kuyper is very optimistic about the technology of his time. Kuyper lived in a time in the late 19th century, the late 1800s in the West, when Christians truly believed that they were going to bring the kingdom of God in the 20th century, in the 1900s. That would be the last century. And the technology and the advancements of the Western world were evidence that God was blessing the Western world. And Kuyper connected all of this to common grace. Now, of course, all of this in the West ended with World War I, when they took all that technology, these so-called developed Western countries took all of this technology and they turned it against each other in a very brutal war. It happened again in World War II. And that's how you move away from that kind of optimism. But Kuyper he wasn't alive during World War II. He didn't live much longer after World War I. And in the time when he's writing, it's very optimistic. And he believes that this is evidence of God's common grace. And so his context is saying that, look what common grace is doing. God is using common grace to develop technology, to do these kinds of things. And all of this optimism is justified by his context, late modern Europe. And so he thinks common grace, again, late modern Europe, one of the most technologically, educationally advanced societies of his day, one which which the church can influence the culture on the whole. Kuyper, he's a man of his time. He views the world through this lens of racial superiority, which was very common in his day and time. And because of this, Kuyper's common grace, I think it has some problems. I think it's a bit syncretistic to Western culture of this time, in particular because Kuyper argues that special grace, as evidenced by what Kuyper calls the Christian nations of Europe, actually elevates common grace. In other words, the special grace of redemption that we see in the Christian nations of Europe actually make common grace come to a higher fulfillment. Now, how is that possible? Because Kuyper says, look at our culture, look at our technological advancement, look at our education, look at our science, look at our healthcare, look at these. They're the best in the world. It's obvious that God blesses those areas with special grace, these so-called Christian nations in Europe and America, with greater common grace. And it makes us superior to the rest of the world. This is very problematic, I think. I disagree with Kuyper here. What I find interesting when we bring Wang Yi into the picture is that, like Kuyper, Wang Yi, he lives in one of the fastest developing countries in the world when we look at technological and economic advancement in China. But unlike Kuyper, Wang Yi's context is one where the church is not welcome in the public square. Contrarily, in Wang Yi's context, the church is persecuted precisely for attempting to have a voice in the public space. This is a public space in China that is reserved exclusively for the state. And so when the state employs its vast economic resources and technological advancement to persecute the church, we saw that when I was in China, you certainly saw that. And especially during COVID, that really came to full fruition during COVID, when the state uses these economic and technological resources to persecute the church. There's going to be more suspicion about these advancements in culture actually being a sign of God's common grace. So although Wang Yi's doctrine of common grace largely agrees with Kuyper and Bavinck's, it does not lead him toward the same optimism of cultural achievement and advancement as it does, particularly for Kuyper. Rather, what Wang Yi has is a subdued common grace. And Wang Yi's subdued common grace focuses, which I think is more appropriately, on the transformative role of special grace than in God's work in common grace. This is evident when Wang Yi does things. He compares, or he contrasts the core level issue of idolatry in Chinese culture. He sees idolatry in Chinese culture. This is the main issue. Technological advancement in Chinese culture is a much less important, much lower level issue. For Wang Yi, not all advancement is evidence of God's common grace, like it was for Kuyper. Furthermore, Wang Yi's context leaves no place in his theological framework for a doctrine like Kuyper's, where special grace elevates common grace. If common grace is evidenced by technological advancement, if that's the case, if technology is automatically a sign of common grace, like Kuyper suggests it is, then no place in the world has received more common grace from God over the past 30 years than China. Nevertheless, China can't be considered to be a nation of special grace. In no way can its culture, wider culture, be characterized as a Christian culture. So Wang Yi's context challenges Kuyper's formulation that special grace elevates common grace. And while this doctrine alone can't be credited for Kuyper's racism, I do think it contributes to Kuyper's racism and his problematic writings. And I think Wang Yi's subdued common grace actually serves as a corrective to Kuyper here. Okay, number 3, a missional institution. So for Kuyper, the mission of the church, when he looks at the institutional church and the organic church, the mission of the church is actually done by the organic church out in the world, where the institutional church serves as more of a supply tent for the organic church. However, what Wang Yi believes is that the institutional church needs to be open. So in a context like China, the reality is that the house church, just in meeting together on Sunday mornings, when the government says you are not to meet together without our permission, without registering with us, without joining our organization, Three Self Church, just that meeting together, that's a public witness. And it's a public witness to the sovereignty of Christ over his church and to the independence of the church from the state. So house churches themselves in their institutional meeting, remember the church's institution, that's the church gathered on Sundays, actually are witnessing, actually are holding a public witness to society. That's why we see Wang Yi, when he talks about ecclesiology, he frequently calls for house churches to seek stronger institutional structures, to not be fearful of a more open existence. Now, of course, nowadays that's much more difficult. But in the time when Wang Yi was preaching these things, churches were still meeting fairly openly. And if churches have this opportunity, if they're not coerced into hiding, into meeting in small groups and things like that, they should still meet openly and they should meet publicly. Additionally, in Wang Yi's view, as the institutional church has a more stable shape within Chinese society, its very existence is going to serve as a model for an alternate kingdom to the kingdoms of the world. So the church in society will actually serve to transform society just by its meeting together on Sunday mornings. This broadens the mission of the church. So the mission of the church is not just done by the organic church being scattered Monday to Saturday, but it's actually being done on Sunday mornings when the church gathers. The church is serving as a witness to society, a witness to Christ's sovereignty and Christ's kingship, and a witness to the gospel to society just by meeting together when it's told not to meet together. And as the church develops more institutions, the church actually serves to do things like develop more stable governance in house churches, more transparency with finances, with plurality of elders, with more formal polities and things like that. When the church does things like this, it's actually serving as a witness. As the church becomes more open in its institutional nature and more structured in its institutional nature, it will witness. The institutional church will be a witness along with the organic church in society. Kuyper doesn't leave a place for this. For Kuyper, really, the organic church is the one that does the witness. The institutional church is just where Christians will gather together, get fueled up by the means of grace, and go out. Now, Wang Yi agrees with that. Again, I said this before. The institutional church certainly serves the role of fueling the organic church, but the institutional church also serves a missional purpose. So in this context of persecution for Wang Yi, there are three options for churches. You can bow to state sovereignty, like the Three Self Church. You can hide away and comply with the state's desire to monopolize the societal influence, like traditional house churches have done. Or you can exist publicly as an institutional entity separate from the state with its own non-state sanctioned polity, its own mission, its own purpose, in a way that's very prophetic to society. And when church and state stand in such direct opposition to each other, the institutional church is almost forced into a position of being a prophetic missionary to society just by its institutional existence. And so this is, I think, how Wang Yi actually modifies Kuyper's understanding of the church as institute and organism. Next, Bavinck's Catholicity. Again, Wang Yi shares Bavinck's theological concept of the Catholicity of Christianity and the church. Wang Yi's grasp of the Catholicity of Christianity, it has a certain eschatological bend to it that isn't quite there with Bavinck. It differs somewhat from Bavinck's. Bavinck's emphasis is on the elimination of dualism between Christianity and the world in the mind of Christians within the church. Bavinck doesn't want Christianity to think the world is evil out there. It cannot be redeemed. And what we do here in church, that's our world. That kind of dualism Bavinck wants to do away with. Now, Wang Yi, he doesn't disagree with Bavinck here at all. In fact, Wang Yi shares a dislike with Bavinck for the worldviews of dualism. But Wang Yi's concept of Catholicity centers more on the inbreaking of God's future kingdom into the world. This is the eschatological aspect of Bavinck's Catholicity. And what happens in this light, Catholicity actually brings out an alternate reality. And that reality is that Christ's inaugurated kingdom presents a different kingdom, an alternate kingdom to the kingdoms of this world. In other words, Christianity is Catholic because Jesus reigns, because Jesus is king. And in return, the church is Catholic because it manifests Christ's kingship in the world. And you see, because the context in China is one in which the state demands that everything in society, including the church, serve its own atheistic ideology, those churches that don't place themselves under this ideological structure are persecuted. And what happens is this creates a stronger divide between the kingdoms of the earth than the kingdoms of the earth and Christ's kingdom than what we see in Bavinck's world when Christians can actively actually serve in the political realm. Bavinck was a member of parliament. Kuyper was a member of parliament and actually became prime minister of the Netherlands. That's not going to happen with Wang Yi in communist China or for many Christians. You don't have that kind of a voice in the world of China. So in Wang Yi's claim, he rejects any kind of a structural dualism that suggests that there's a sacred secular dualism in the world, but he does recognize that there is this covenantally rooted that there is this, well, how do you put it? There is a sort of dualism that temporarily is in the world because the kingdom of God is still inaugurated, where the kingdoms of the world still oppose the kingdom of God. And why is that? Because the kingdom of God claims a Catholicity, claims a universality over those kingdoms of the world. And so, of course, they come into opposition. This is eschatological in nature. It's because Christ reigns that he will reign in the end, and the church, in response, manifests that kingdom reign to the world. That's going to create a lot of conflict between the church and the world. So that's how Wang Yi sort of modifies Bavinck's concept of Catholicity. The last area, the fifth area, is sphere sovereignty and Kuyper's sphere sovereignty. And Wang Yi has what I call an antithetical sphere sovereignty. So if you know Kuyper's work, you know antithesis, common grace. Common grace is one concept. The antithesis is the other. The antithesis, the impact of sin on the world. It's Satan's lies about the nature of reality in the world. All of us are impacted by the antithesis. Well, Wang Yi's concept of sphere sovereignty serves to confirm Kuyper's suspicions about governmental power. Kuyper was very suspicious about governmental power in his age. What Wang Yi lives in and what you all live in the China of today is kind of Kuyper's worst fear of a government that's not just one sphere in society, but actually takes the place of God as sovereign himself over every area and every sphere of society. And so that's what Wang Yi is facing. That's what you all face. Wang Yi ministers under a state that openly seeks dominance in every sphere of society in a way that is antithetical to Christianity. In his context, state and church exist on the basis of opposing world views with little hope for similarity. Wang Yi clearly understands that the Chinese government under the CCP seeks a monopolizing societal hegemony in which the state controls everything. Since God is removed from the state's version of reality, because it's an atheistic worldview of communism, this leaves the state as the ultimate sovereign overall. So in all other spheres, they serve under the state. So the Communist Party also believes in sphere sovereignty, just like Kuyper does, just like Wang Yi does. Only in the Communist Party version, Christ is not king over all, the state's head over all, and every other sphere is under the kingship of the state. The church, therefore, can exist, but only under state recognition and control. right? There is no plurality in this sense. So for house churches that seek this kind of a existence of plurality as their own sphere, and for house churches that reject state sovereignty, what happens is this leaves the state to bear the God-given power of the sword against the church sphere, ironically. They bear it, but the state bears it in a very sinful way against the church. So understandably, Wang Yi's understanding of sphere sovereignty is very pessimistic regarding the state. For Kuyper, sphere sovereignty was kind of this method by which the state could be redeemed. If we operate under sphere sovereignty, it puts the state in its right place. But Wang Yi seems to recognize there are situations where the state stands in such a stark antithetical relationship to God that judgment is actually more likely for the state than redemption is. And I think he believes that about the Communist Party. Wang Yi's understanding of sphere sovereignty is highlighted in multiple works on church-state relations, and they present a state that opposes Christ as king. And in Wang Yi's context of persecution, the state manifests Kuyper's antithesis in a way that, frankly, is not feasible to Kuyper, who was a Dutch theologian in a time when he could actually become prime minister of the state, on the basis, by the way, of his Christian worldview. So in this way, Wang Yi presents sphere sovereignty as a faithful biblical way to understand society, even in context of persecution. Now, I think all of this should explain, why does Wang Yi do the things that he does? Why is it that Wang Yi speaks out against the government's persecution of Christianity, speaks out against the state when the state oversteps its boundaries into the area of the church? Why is it that Wang Yi and early reign will do things like speak to the issues of society, like abortion, like poverty, like the failures of infrastructure and things like that during the Wenchuan earthquake? Why do they do this? Why is Wang Yi so strongly opposed to the Three Self Church? Well, the answer to these are found, I think, rooted in his affiliation with neo-Calvinist public theology. You see, the Three Self Church has chosen to comply with the state and therefore to put itself under state sovereignty. For Wang Yi, this is unacceptable. If Christ is king and he's declared that the church is to manifest his kingdom in one way, the state has another purpose under his sovereignty, then the state has no right to tell the church when and where it can meet, to tell the church who can be a pastor, to tell the church these kinds of things. Therefore, Wang Yi argues against these things. This is why he argues against joining the Three Self Church. He does not view the Three Self Church as a true church because its ultimate head is not Christ. Its ultimate head is a state, not just any state, but an atheistic state that has an opposing worldview to that of the church and of the kingdom of God. Its eschatological vision is the Communist Party's head over everything, not the eschatological vision of the Bible, which is Christ's kingship here on earth as it is in heaven. So I want to conclude that I believe that much of Wang Yi's motivation and the foundation of Wang Yi's work and the things that he did can be found in his understanding of public theology and the church's place in the public square. This is an understanding that is drawn from neo-Calvinist public theological sources like Kuyper and Bavinck. However, what I've found was that Wang Yi modifies Western neo-Calvinism in significant ways that makes it much more adaptable to situations of persecution, and consequently makes neo-Calvinism, I think, more of a faithful and biblical public theological stance, not only for the church in China, but also for situations in the global church outside of the Western world where millions of believers today face persecution for their faith. Abraham Kuyper's most famous quote by far, it's his most well-known quote, is that there is not 1 square inch over all of life in which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine. This is this great statement that Kuyper makes of Christ's sovereignty over all. But what Wang Yi recognizes is that opposite of Christ's mine are kingdoms and authorities in this world who also cry mine over every square inch of life. Wang Yi understands that in spite of the suffering that comes, as the eschatological picture of Christ's kingdom in the world and to the world, the church still has a responsibility to proclaim to the world Christ mine over all of creation. As Jesus suffered on the cross while awaiting his resurrection, so the church that bears the image of Christ to the world under the headship of Christ bears her cross until we experience that final resurrection in the glorious kingdom that is to come, when Christ is recognized as King and sovereign over all. Thank you so much for your time.